Thank you so much. Oh, I want to extend a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Smriti Rao, and I am a professor of economics at Assumption University. I am here as the research leader for South Asia in the Asian Political Economy program at the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst. The Asian Political Economy program is aimed at extending research on the region of Asia. We focus on interdisciplinary scholarship that examines the political economy of the Asian region and its impact on the larger global economy. And we're particularly focused on themes such as cities and urbanization, rural transformation, internal migration, class relations, labor, ecological issues, the role of the state, and regimes of capitalism. Today's conversation is aimed at helping us attain a richer understanding of what might be one of the most significant social movements in post-liberalization India. As all of you, I'm sure, are aware, the farmers' movement that ranged for about a year won a significant and decisive victory in November 2021 against the Indian state, a very unusual victory in the recent sort of history of India. In that three farm laws that the Indian government had proposed without democratic consultations in August 2020 were withdrawn unconditionally. Our effort here today is to understand some of the questions around this very significant event. Why did farmers protest the new farm laws? Who was at the protests? Who was supposed to benefit from the farm laws? And how does this agitation help us to understand India's political economy under its current political dispensation? And in fact, what do we learn, if anything, about whether this is indeed Modi's India, as our title suggests? So our very distinguished panel and discussants today will address these questions with a special emphasis on the class, gender, and caste dimensions of this year-long agitation. The format of the panel is as follows. Each of our 5 speakers will speak for about 15 minutes, followed by a 5 to 7 minute long response from each of our 2 discussants. We'll then give the speakers a chance to respond, and then we will turn it over to questions and answers from the audience. You might notice that the chat is disabled for those of you in the audience. But what we will do is we'll put in a link to a Google form, and you can submit your questions there. And we'll periodically keep putting that link into the chat. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can, in the Q&A session. So now, without further ado, I want to introduce our very first speaker, Professor Barbara Harris-White. Professor Barbara Harris-White drove from Cambridge to New Delhi in 1969. These are her words. And has been studying India through fieldwork ever since. Essentially, she never left, which is, entirely, a wonderful thing for those of us who want to learn and research India, because her work has been extremely influential. She's a political economist who has focused on agrarian change, on aspects of deprivation, small town informal economy, and most recently, the economy as a waste-producing system. And of course, she has written and published widely on all of these topics. So it is my pleasure and honor to turn the floor over to Barbara.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Smriti, and happy Women's Day. This has been a very bad week for people in Europe, and Chomsky and Harvey have just circulated essays to say it's been a very bad week for the world order. And I'm thinking especially of importers of Ukrainian and Russian grain. But today's topic is not a light one either. I've offered to supply background, and so if you'll let me share my screen, I've got a dozen slides. Whoops. Share screen. Here we go. Can you see the screen? Good. Please note the long-suffering hornbill on the top of Mr. Modi's head from Arunachal. I'm going to argue that the farm protests, the subject of this afternoon, result from a concatenated crisis, which has long-term, medium-term, and short-term contexts. The long-term context, I'm thinking of a half century plus, involves acute environmental degradation, which I'm not really going to talk about. But it involves the persistent miniaturization of holdings, or the persistence of miniaturized holdings, while their density has increased enormously, together with increased landlessness. These are long-term processes. And many, for the last 50, even 100 years, have been said to be chronically unviable without the help of income from livestock, remittances, wages, self-employment, and so on and so forth. In the medium term, which I'm taking to be this century, many of you will be very familiar and better than I am to explain, declines in public expenditure, in infrastructure for agriculture, and in the role of agriculture in GDP. Agriculture has now become labeled in policy terms as a welfare sector. And yet, as Meghala Krishnamurti has written, agriculture became the safety net during the COVID crisis and created 8 more jobs than happened in manufacturing or construction. In the 21st century, prices have become more volatile. The cost price squeeze, which is worst felt by small farmers, has deteriorated. The growth rate of agriculture has declined, even though it's performed well during COVID, and there's been an explosion of debt. In the short term, by which I mean after 2014, the agricultural sector has reeled from demonetization, a number of other thunderclap policies, and the COVID response. I'll be talking about the promise to double farm incomes from 2016 to 2022, which potentially might involve very big riches for the 6% of India's farmers with more than 10 hectares, and now the farm laws. It seems to me, thinking about the background to the farm protests, which is my topic, that we can consider at the very least 5 interrelated elements to the current socioeconomic crisis in rural India. They are wages, returns to production, farm incomes, the constitution of the mandis, the markets, and the new scale of corporate capital. So in my time, I'm just going to explain the contours of these 5 interrelated elements. I'm sorry that these slides are congested. That's because I only just wrote them. I'm going to go through them quickly, and if any of you want the detail of them, I'm very happy to send you the PowerPoint. Let's look at wages. Agriculture has performed a historic role, not expected by Western development economists, but as a labor sponge. It was 70% of total labor at independence, and it's now 55%. And the landless element among that has increased enormously. So we see that modern agriculture, mechanized agriculture, is both an opportunity for labor with more seasons, helped by irrigation and tractors, but also a threat to labor from harvesters, from threshers, and from post-harvest technology. We know that wages are low, but they're regionally uneven. Look at the Kerala rate from February this year, 706 rupees a day, which seems like a fortune for people in the Bimaru states, where it's about 1/3 of that. So there's enormous regional variation. Labor costs are quite a significant element in the cost of production, and agricultural employers must try to keep this cost as low as they can. Government of India economists are focusing on agricultural labor in recent publications as a dangerously rising cost in the 21st century. And because cost inflation driven by labor is argued to affect the entire economy. It affects the structure of prices. So agricultural labor wages must be kept low to retain rates of return in agriculture. So Niti Aayog is all in favor of a new wave of mechanization to displace agriculture. The question for us might be, did agricultural labor play a small part in the protests, since the history of agricultural labor is that they're divided and ruled and marginalized? I want you to remember that agricultural production persisted during the year-long protest, and it was in the hands of labor, which kept it going. Turning to production itself and farm incomes, there's a lot of debate about real increases in farm incomes. We don't really know what they are because the data isn't being collected, but the average income for the average farmer, which is pretty meaningless, is about £1 lakh a year. Discounting for the consumer price index and for inflation, the growth may be negative for all but the top deciles. And we know that the input-output terms of trade are turning increasingly adverse to agriculture. I said before, agrarian structure is uniquely miniaturized, and for 86% of farm households with under 2 hectares, they get only about 1/3 of their income from agriculture, and the rest must come from other activities. So we've seen a disproportionate increase in costs, which is not matched by increases in output, and we've seen an explosion in debt. Now, Modi Sarkar promised to double farm incomes between 2016, when he made the promise, and 2022. That promise is broken. The committee in charge extends the idea of 5 years to 2023. They've moved the goalposts. They want to bring incomes into parity with the non-farm economy, which is quite ridiculous. And they believe in technology, a great spray of more and more unlikely solutions, technological solutions to this problem of income. And the stakes are now very high. Agricultural incomes have become part of the battleground. And I don't think, one of the rest of the panel may know, but I don't think we really know the trend of incomes. One of the elements of the protest was the Electricity Amendment Bill, which seeks to centralize the regulation and the privatization and management of subsidies, which is another threat to the cost of production. Okay, those are the first 3 crises, elements in the crises. The next 2 slides I simply can't talk to, I will just outline. But they are to do with the mandis, the markets, and the regulation of markets, which the farm laws are interfering with, or try to interfere with. Most of India's marketed surplus is marketed in villages, mostly to private traders and money lenders who've been demonized for at least 100 years. Exchange relations between farmers and traders are class specific. They are also specific to commodities. And there's a very big literature on interlocked contracts, which suggests that they're exploitive, especially for small producers. But traders and moneylenders provide a range of services. They've been dubbed clientelist, not just economic services, but social services. And many livelihoods are created in the post-harvest system. The bigger local traders are the masters of the countryside. They're regarded as long-time BJP supporters, although many of them are vicars of Bray. They support anybody who's in power. And there's a big debate about whether they're essentially inefficient or whether they perform a role for the state or for large-scale capital, which is why they're left in peace. Now, we tend to classify marketing through stages, but actually, if you look at what they do and you classify them by activities, you realize that traders are not a single kind of firm, but they have tendencies to complex permutations of activities and to uniqueness, which may be a form of resilience to shock in the market system. Traders accumulate probably more than producers do. They integrate vertically, diagonally, they move out of agriculture, they move into jobs into the state, and they are only now becoming more cosmopolitanized in caste terms. And throughout the whole of India, when you look at market structures, local private oligopolies tend to coexist with very large numbers of small traders, and markets are continually commodifying. Now, there are two ways in which these markets have been regulated over time. One is the APMCs, the regulated markets. There are 7,000. There are not enough. They serve much larger areas than they were recommended to. Each state has its own specific market laws. The intention was to improve the first transaction between farmers and traders and to democratize price formation and auctions, but actually they're patchily implemented. In some places they work well, but many grow weeds or they're the site of local cartels, and they're even laundromats for black money. Now, some states have already deregulated APMCs. Bihar is the textbook case, and it hasn't been a happy story. Other states have started to free up restrictions. In other words, you didn't need the Central Government Act for states to free up the way they regulate the first transaction. And yet, despite or because of APMCs, India's long had an integrated national market, even if it's also a bit segmented and imperfect. But it's not a recent thing, India's national agricultural market. However, in parts of the Northwest, parts of UP and Madhya Pradesh, grain is purchased at a minimum support price by the Food Corporation using commission agents in the regulated markets. And those commission agents act as bankers for the FCI and lenders to producers. Now, while this kind of arrangement is strategically important for the PDS, and while the minimum support price is strategically important for food security, this arrangement is unusual. The rest of India doesn't behave, the markets are not structured in this particular way. Now, the PDS is based on a completely different principle from the regulated markets. Regulated markets assume all that's needed is a tweak, better conditions for the first transaction. The PDS assumes that direct public control of the distribution system is necessary for various kinds of social purpose. The FCI dominates that system, but every state can, and most do, establish their own corporations for different parts of this state-controlled system of distribution. So agricultural markets in India have developed in regulative tension, these two opposing principles. They're okay, they're not okay. Tweak the first transaction, replace it with a public distribution system. And anybody studying it, I think, would conclude that it needs better regulation and not deregulation. But meanwhile, we have competition from a new scale of corporate capital. The point I want to make about the Adanis and the Ambanis is that this has been long in the coming. The idea behind it is that low returns, non-performing assets drive corporate capital to seek low-risk investments, and agriculture is a sitting duck. But I don't think it's so simple, because corporate activity, direct activity, must be confined to inputs and export commodities. And it has. In tiny font, I've given you the example of Adani, but Adani has been doing this since the year 2000, has invested in grain storage, has tenders with the FCI made in 2005, lasting 20 years, has expanded silos in 8 states under 3 different governments of India, has got his port to plate, end-to-end infrastructure in place, and is now engaging in trading, including with China. He's been encouraged not just by the BJP, but he's been encouraged for at least 2 decades. Now, this scale of corporate capital, and there are about 10 big agri-corporates in India, faces the 75% of Indian farmers with tiny holdings, with an enormous step change in the huge power asymmetry that they face with their marketed surplus. They will face an inscrutable price environment with no redress for malpractices and less choice rather than more. Now, why would this be encouraged? It's encouraged to keep the structure of informal prices in the economy intact and to keep the distributive shares tipping away from wages and towards capital. It also threatens the intermediate classes, but they're not part of the farm law protest. Okay, I could say much more, but I just want to finish with 2-3 slides about the farm laws and the protests. My colleagues on this panel are going to say a great deal more of this, so I just want to note them and ask the question, who wrote these farm laws, and for what purpose? We're going to be talking about the protest. However, there's some very powerful interests, and I've identified 4 supportive of those farm laws which were repealed. Firstly, some of the farmers' unions supported the farm laws. They felt it would make agriculture more competitive. It would that it would be level the playing field between private trade and the state. This tense balance, enable farmers to control trade, expect foreign direct investment and private investment in infrastructure. The masters of the countryside, the intermediate classes, agri-commerce, supported the farm laws. I think there may be other views in this panel because of the prospect of being recruited as agents for corporates, since they already profit from being agents for FCI. And their own diversification out of agricultural trade reduces some of the stakes that we would otherwise think they were facing. Organized industry, FICCI, CII, ASOCHAM, very rattled by the protest, saw the farm laws as pro-business, again, welcomed FDI and agri-commerce and removing entry barriers for big capital and an enormous proliferating high-tech digital tech market platform sector. And lastly, the private grain oligopoly that rules the grain trade of the world and is very much in bed with the World Trade Organization and the Bretton Woods institutions, and also the management consultants that Indian government increasingly uses for policies. So they work behind the scenes. ABCD, ADM, Bunge, Cargill and Dreyfus, 4 of the 6 big private companies, they penetrate India through what are being called now reverse subsidies from labor to the corporate sector, especially in maize and in soybean. And they work in the background, backed by the World Trade Organization and the management consultancies, which are attacking India's subsidies for food security, PDS subsidies and state distribution.
Barbara, I think you're...
this is, can I have 30 seconds?
Yes.
I've put in cartoon form the interests of the farm law repeal. Yes, a triumph for the protesters, an unprecedented triumph for the protesters, and lessons to be learned from their organization. But also, it was timely for electoral gain, especially for Uttar Pradesh, because the BJP was isolated through this process. Then it's in the interests of industry and services. They don't need the farm laws. They can do what they want to do without the farm laws. And the very final slide is that despite this unprecedented protest, the repeal of the farm laws and the victory to the protesters don't solve what Prakash Karat called the crisis of neoliberalism, the 5 things that I've tried to outline. I'm sorry if I've taken too much time, but that's it for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was really very helpful. I'm going to turn to our second speaker, who's again sort of very distinguished public intellectual, Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar. He was formerly professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. His areas of interest include the role of finance and industry in development, and he's published, of course, very widely, including recently 2 books, one on demonetization Decoded, and the second titled Karl Marx's Capital and the Present, 4 essays. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Chandrasekhar.
Thank you, Smriti. Yeah, it's a pleasure being here with this distinguished panel. Um, well, Barbara has given us a comprehensive background to the set of factors, both long-term and medium-term and short-term, which sort of led up to the protests and the as yet unclear outcomes as far as that protest is concerned. What I'll try and do is really add a kind of footnote by sort of making a speculative effort at answering the question: how come you have a situation where the state's belief, the government's belief, the NDA government's belief, that in two senses. First, in the sense that it can persuade farmers into believing that this is actually completely in their interest. It would be in their interest because everything from the past remains. The APMC markets would remain in some sense. The MSP would remain. But on the other hand, the farmers would have the choice of trading outside these markets, these regulated markets. Farmers would have the choice of entering into direct relationships with buyers, which could include corporates entering into contract farming arrangements. And therefore, it really is a situation in which what you're doing is expanding choice. You're actually expanding choice and providing farmers the ability to be able to maximize and to a certain extent stabilize their incomes by deciding at each point of time, at the end of every season, in every marketing year, to deciding which of these sort of channels or opportunities they would use in order to maximize their returns. It really was what was in one sense surprising for many who were advocating these kinds of neoliberal reforms, that the state was not in a position to be able to persuade the farmers into believing that this is something which would actually benefit them in terms of stabilization, increase in incomes. This was also surprising to them, I think, because of the fact that conventionally what you would see is that the private sector, and here the principal private operators in agricultural production are the farmers, the private sector is against state regulation, according to the neoliberal perception, that state regulation is something which in some sense constrains them, reduces their flexibility, distorts markets, and so on and so forth. And therefore, withdrawing to a certain extent, regulation would be something which farmers see as positive. Now, why exactly were farmers so clear that these arguments don't hold? And in what sense was it related to the experience of Indian agriculture and the context in which it has been functioning for a very long period of time? And I want to go back in history to the early post-independence years and subsequently to try and provide, as I said, some kind of a speculative answer to this question of why this ability, this attempt to persuade and win over farmer support for these farm laws really did not work in practice. Now, if we go back to independence, at which point of time we know, estimates by Blinn and others, we know that that had been almost half a century of stagnation in agriculture. That was a period in which, if you look at it in terms of per capita output and availability of food, that it appeared that even in reasonably good years, forget years of bad monsoons and bad harvests, a certain amount of rationing would be necessary in order to be able to ensure that everybody gets access to a certain amount of food. And therefore, if you look at what should have been the agenda of the post-independent state, that agenda should have been an attempt to try and increase productivity, besides, of course, bringing in cultivation, bringing new land into cultivation, would be to increase productivity and raise the rate of growth of agricultural production in order to at least get to a situation in which, in per capita terms, given the level and distribution of incomes and therefore the level of demand for food, you would be in a position to be able to service the demands and the requirements of net purchasers of food who are able to effectively demand, because of the incomes they have, the food they need. Now, in practice, of course, we know that if we take the first 15 years after independence, what was interesting is that this goal wasn't really achieved in any significant measure. And even to the extent that you had increases in agricultural output, it did not come so much from yield increases, or principally from yield increases, but significantly also from increases into in areas under cultivation, the opportunities for which, of course, were exhausted by the mid-1960s. So if you look at it in terms of the rate of growth of let's say, food grain production, and I'm going to focus on food grains, on food, relative to the rate of growth of population, you really did not have great success in terms of taking this objective forward, so much so that per capita production and availability seemed to be near stagnant. In fact, there were, in bad years, you actually saw significant declines. Now, why did this happen? Why, in some sense, despite the recognition of this crisis, this underlying crisis in agriculture and therefore in the economy as a whole, did not get addressed, it was puzzling, partly because of the fact that so long as you continued with this situation, it would have become necessary for the government to actually rely to a certain extent on imports in order to meet the requirements, particularly in urban areas, to meet the demands of the net purchasers of food, in urban and to a certain extent in rural areas, where, of course, the public distribution system of that time didn't really reach, and even today doesn't reach. And now that was a problem because, despite the fact that India had some foreign exchange reserves, which came because of the accumulation of its wartime reserves in the Bank of England, by the time we got to the mid-1950s, balance of payments difficulties were significant. 1957-58 was a foreign exchange crisis. So there was a limit to which you could actually use your foreign exchange to import in order to enhance supply and meet this objective of actually servicing the demands of net purchasers of food. Now, the reason, despite this, you actually didn't see as much of a push in agriculture as you saw in industry, what with the second five-year plan, Nehru's ideas, the Mahalanobis model, and so on, partly was because of, we know with hindsight, was because of the access which India got to rupee imports of food under PL 418. And in fact, if you look at the period in the late 50s and through the 60s, till of course the mid 60s, when we lost access to that in substantial measure, you had a situation where people like Dandekar and so on argued that there was a significant increase in the amount of food which was put through the public distribution system, and something like 75% of that was really serviced with imports substantially from PL 480. So this access to rupee imports allowed the system to actually meet what was an obvious crisis. But that had one consequence, and that consequence was it depressed domestic prices. Now, this led to a number of arguments. I mean, Nirmal Chandra, for example, argued that there were excess imports, that you were importing far more than was necessary to actually reasonably service the public distribution system. Sukumar Chakravarti argued that agriculture was treated as a bargain sector. The understanding was that if you wanted industrial growth, then you had to put a lot of money in there. You have to increase the share of investment which goes there. But if you wanted agricultural growth, you tinker with institutional change, land reforms, which of course didn't get implemented, cooperativization. These elements were seen as mechanisms by which you could unleash, in some sense, the energy of the peasantry and increase output. You didn't have to put much money into agriculture. It appeared, in practice, that was the understanding, in order to be able, in investments in irrigation, drainage, flood control, etc., in large measure, in order to increase yields and therefore accelerate the rate of growth of agriculture. But not only did the state not do that, what you actually had was, because of this reliance on imports to service the public distribution system, you depressed domestic prices, the so-called urban bias in Indian policy, which resulted in a situation where you disincentivized to a certain extent even private investment. Of course, there were limits to private investment coming from the fact that burdened by exploitative tenancy contracts, much of the actual cultivators didn't have either the means or the incentive to invest. But in any case, one incentive which could have been there, which would have been a reasonable price, which would have operated even if market supply and demand was allowed to play a role in determining the level of price, then you would possibly have got some investment. But because you focused more on providing the needs of the consumers in terms of affordable food, access to food at affordable prices, using PL480 imports that actually had a consequence in terms of this crisis in agriculture persisting. Now, if you look at it, what is the implication of this? The implication of this is that it's not demand and supply per se, which is determining the level of prices, and therefore the terms of trade between agriculture and the rest of the economy. Of course, agriculture is not homogeneous. It affects different classes differently, as Barbara has also mentioned. But the point is the terms of trade is now actually being engineered, being manipulated by the state by using access to non-foreign exchange-based imports of food, which actually tends to keep down prices and therefore shifts the terms of trade against agriculture in favor of industry. Now, what happened in the 1960s is really faced with this crisis, particularly after the two bad harvests of the mid-1960s, made it very clear that you will not be able to sustain growth in this economy if this agrarian crisis continues, and India launched the Green Revolution strategy. A central and crucial element of the Green Revolution strategy was, of course, the minimum support price. And the minimum support price actually now created a situation where agricultural prices were now not really, determined by supply given demand, and supply being enhanced by imports. Agricultural prices were now being determined on a cost plus basis. And this really created a situation where it was possible for the farming community, not always successfully, to push the state into providing it with remunerative prices and prices which would be considered as being adequate enough to ensure the viability of crop production. Okay. Now, over a period of time, that became a real problem because of the many things which Barbara pointed out, the fall in yields, particularly in the surplus producing states and regions and so on. And what happened to groundwater levels, the coming of acidity, etc., etc. But the basic point is, at least there was this ability to actually have an entity to address in order to try and ensure that you could, to a certain extent, get yourself reasoned returns, and you could protect yourself against a non-benign market shifting the terms of trade against you, partly because of the growing strength of corporate capital in post-independence India, and especially, of course, after liberalization. Now, I do think that in some sense, the reason why, along with the opposition to the farm laws, MSP became such a crucial issue, recurring in the demands of the farmers, was because of the fact that the farmers basically wanted to ensure that this now becomes, has two features. One, it is made it's legally guaranteed. They wanted legislative action just as much as the farm laws. They wanted legislative action to ensure the MSP, and they wanted an MSP based on the Swaminathan formula, which is C2 plus 50%. This was a crucial element of their demand. And really, if you look at many of the things which farm laws were doing, to a certain extent, contract farming, to a certain extent, liberalization of APMC regulations, something like 12 or more states had already, amended the APMC laws, etc. We had already started moving in the direction of putting in place a regime of the kind that these three laws were trying to do in one shot. But why they became important in this context was because this was seen as an effort on the part of the state for two reasons. One, because of course it's business friendly or corporate crony friendly policies, and because of the fact that many of these corporates, particularly the big two, were essentially given their interests in organized retailing and given their interest in entering into food processing and the agricultural trade, that they wanted to actually not have to go through the APMCs, but go directly to the farmer and negotiate in ways in which the laws actually allowed you to do it without even having access to the courts, because it was the sub-divisional magistrate and the collector who was going to make the decision when a dispute arose. But the whole idea was that doing this together with the other reason it was felt why the government was doing this, which was it's growing adherence to neoliberal fiscal reform, in which it did not want to offer the food subsidies, which would actually result in a fiscal deficit which would be too large. Okay, so therefore, for these two reasons, neoliberal fiscal reform and the need to actually be corporate friendly, resulted in a situation where you needed, one, of course, to dismantle the regulatory framework, but dismantling that regulatory framework for these purposes also would have involved dismantling over a period of time both supply through the public distribution system, but you just cannot only get rid of supply, because otherwise if you're procuring and you have your carrying costs, you still will have a subsidy bill. So you need to actually get rid of procurement as well. And that would have meant that the one instrument the farmers had to prevent the terms of trade being shifted against them would to a certain extent have got undermined, even though, as I said, they are private operators, and private operators are supposed to be not for government regulation. They actually wanted the government to stay, to actually increase its presence, to strengthen the MSP, to legally guarantee it, and to build the public distribution system so that it would be able to use the surpluses it procures in ways in which it wouldn't be actually, you wouldn't be subject to the argument that the food is rotting in the government's godowns. So I do think that this factor, the role of the state as an agent in moving the terms of trade in favor of corporate capital or in favor of agriculture, and having in some sense an agent to approach to ensure that you get your due, that was what was persuaded the farmers that they're not going to buy into this argument that these laws and the liberalization it involved was something which is good for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chandru. Thank you for that very important context. I want to turn now to our third speaker, Navsharan Singh. She is both an author and an activist. She has researched and published widely on citizenship, sexual violence, Dalit women's rights, labor rights, and on state impunity for mass violence. Her most recent works include Writing Dalit Women in Political Economy of Agrarian Crisis and Resistance in Punjab, Continents Wide and Layers Deep, the Ready-Made Garment Industry in Times of Restructuring, and This Land is Mine, I Am Not of This Land, CAA NRC, and the Manufacture of Statelessness. Her current work revolves around the agrarian crisis in Punjab and the role of landless Dalits and women in the crisis. Navsharan.
Thank you. Thanks, Smriti, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very important discussion. I truly appreciate the opportunity to talk about the farmers' movement and the farmers' protest, which is the longest lasting, most significant peasant mobilization in post-colonial India, and which I had the privilege to observe closely. So happy to be here. I'm also mindful of the fact that there is plurality of agrarian question in India. There are region-specific questions and class formations and agrarian crisis, as we know, also manifest very differently regionally. So as I speak about the farmers' protest and the political economy of India, my comments are actually drawn from the very specific experience of Punjab. It's a region I followed closely, and it has also a long history of strong peasant movements and a very clear articulation of peasant interest in recent decades. And also a strong left mobilization of farmers, strong unions of landless Dalits, and a mobilization, and a very strong mobilization of rural women. So, and today, since Barbara also mentioned and greeted on Women's International Women's Day, which is approaching closely, I would like to say that if there's any women's movement in Punjab on complex gender issues, such as sexual violence, its space is rural and not urban, and some of the large farm unions have played a role in building it. So Punjab has lessons for understanding the larger crisis, agrarian crisis that we are talking about, and many things to offer. So also, just before I start, I'd like to say that there are many aspects of this movement, and there were long-term structural problems which the protest was responding to. Farmers came to seek the rollback of 3 laws, but there were structural issues already, especially pertaining to how agriculture is placed in India's growth trajectory, which my previous two speakers have spoken about. And this protest, as it unfolded, it revealed the deep agrarian crisis which had lain buried under the myth of green revolution in India. And the three laws against which the farmers were mobilized were overlain on an acute agrarian crisis, a crisis which had grown into a festering wound on the body politic of rural India, and also COVID pandemic experience adding to it. So the farm protest, when the farmers came to Delhi, they laid bare this crisis. The large unions which led the protests, they draw their membership from small and marginal farmers largely, and the protest articulated the core concerns of these farmers: increasing costs of inputs and stagnating output prices, stagnating MSP and incomes, the threat of withdrawal of government procurement, increasing hold of corporates on farming, threat of losing land and farmers becoming laborers as small farming becomes unviable, and the lack of alternatives for livelihoods. So these unions had been mobilizing farmers for at least 3 decades, as we know, seeking state accountability for farm crisis, which manifested in indebtedness, suicides, crop failure for defective seeds, and rising prices of farm inputs. And these concerns spoke to the existential crisis. Farmers called it the struggle for identity, their existence, which was playing havoc in their everyday lives, in poorer communities collectively and differentially along caste, gender, and class axes. There were, as I saw the farm protest at Delhi borders, there were multiple agrarian protests which were unfolding at the same time at the borders. So for today, for the limited time we have, I would like to use this opportunity to talk about women in protest from small, marginal and landless communities whose participation helped to open up the political economy of agrarian crisis from a complex gender perspective. So as we know that farmers came to Delhi led by farm unions, with Punjab unions at the forefront, and their convoy of tractor trolleys and trucks, thousands of them extending for several miles, made its way into the capital city of Delhi on November 26, 2020. They came to demand rollback of the 3 farm laws that the parliament had passed in September 2020 in an undemocratic way, and on the sheer dint of power, which was not lost on anyone. So they came and they quickly set up little townships at Delhi borders, mirroring their life back home. Quickly, the farmers also set up multiple protest stages at different entry points in Delhi. So these protest platforms, they featured not only speeches by union leaders, but also performances of music, drama, poetry, folk singing, most of the day and into the evening, highlighting agrarian crisis, rural indebtedness, apathy of the government officials, condition of public schools and hospitals, and women's issues. And these protest stages actually became the university of people resisting, where they learned about their operations and participated in understanding it. So at the protest site, there was also thousands of yellow and green dupattas, which were the omnipresent symbol of women's stirring presence at these protest sites. The leadership of the farm movement is predominantly elderly male with decades of experience of mobilizing farmers on local demands, but women soon acquired a strong position for themselves at the protest. They worked quietly at the back end, but soon women who are never even recognized as farmers, and also has such a small share in land ownership. In Punjab, for example, of the total land holdings, only 1.5% are held by women, and the all India figure is 14%. But women created a space. Very soon they created a space for their concerns, and they forced to be acknowledged by the unions. So the first Women Farmers Day was marked in January, as soon as they had come a month later. And this was the first Women's Day, and there were many more to follow later over the next few months. And on that day, women speakers talked about 3 farm laws and how they affected women. Farmer women, also joined by many other working class women from rural communities. These were para teachers, child care workers, informal employment workers, nurses, Anganwadi workers, and also women from farm suicide victim families who spoke about driven to very lowly valued slave wage contractual jobs because of the crisis. And the crisis of small farmers, especially post 1991, had hit the families hard. And the small farmers who had, by that time, when India liberalized, had somehow managed a precarious balance between high input cost and price of their produce, they came under heavy burden of debt as food prices began to fall in the global market and input prices soared and subsidies began to dry up. There was a study in Punjab by a local university which came up with a number that 89% of marginal and 91% of small farmers were under heavy debt burden by the first decade of the new century. So this, despite the fact that the farm households were also making incomes from non-farm occupations. There were also widening inequalities of ownership of land, especially as is clear in the marginal holdings held by poor have drastically decreased between 1970 and 2015, and the semi-medium and medium have increased. And also this increase of size of holding has been completely captured by rich farmers in Punjab, and making small and marginal landowners out of farming, a process which has been termed as reverse tenancy. What did those who left farming do? There's a Farm Commission report, Punjab Farm Commission report of the late 2000, which says that 25% became labor of which 2% became agriculture labor, others became other kind of labor, 10% into small jobs such as transport, 10% went abroad, and others lived off the rents. But no one documented what happened to women of the small and marginal families after the men left farming. They disappeared from the labor market. And these women were at the protest, these small marginal household family women's talking, they were at the protest talking about lack of work, no means to travel to cities for daily wage, no work in the villages, no cash in hand, and extreme discords in the families as they struggle to meet ends, send children to school, and marry their daughters. So they said they came to seek peace, more insured income, more employment avenues for their children. Only a few days after this, the protesting farmers at Delhi border were joined by hundreds of women farmers and laborers from Punjab. And these women, hundreds of them, came clutching large and small photo frames, portraits, which were portraits of their sons and husbands who had died by suicide over the years when they were unable to pay the farm debt. Many women held 2 portraits, and they were able to speak about, and this was their speaking about the tragic marker of the farm crisis, the suicide. And Punjab has seen over 17,000 farmers and workers dying by suicide between 20 and 2015. While suicides by farmers who had land, they qualify for compensation from the state, and landless laborers' suicide doesn't qualify for any such compensation. So these families bore additional burdens of repaying debts and family members turning into bonded labor and forced work against loans and the stigma. And they asked what was in it, what was there for them in the new laws. So women, when they came, they spoke about their demands. Landless women demanded land so that they can grow food and fodder and live a life of dignity and free of sexual violence. Which has complete impunity when it comes to sexual safety and bodily autonomy of Dalit women, and they drew back the attention to the land reforms. So just to say, there is an acute lack of earning options for women, and they remain stuck in extremely low-paying, back-breaking odd jobs in villages. And dairy remains an important income-generating activity, which has also, for landless, for poor, has totally disappeared, because land became an asset which was controlled more by the bigger farmers, they also controlled the commons, which were used by the landless to grow fodder. So another option dropped out of livelihood, dropped out of their menu, and nobody documented it. But women at the movement actually highlighted these. Finally, to say that with women joining, the farmers' movement's claim on the government expanded. The movement was no longer only about government protection through the minimum support price. The experience of women added to the demands of farmers, who now demanded land, guaranteed minimum wages for farm jobs, and equal wages for women's operations also. So to conclude, I would say that these posed deep questions about policy and between what development theory posited about the role of agriculture and what the protest articulated. The protest also highlighted the lived experience varied by caste, class, and gender. And while watching the protest unfold, the most significant issue that I saw is that the protest forced us to rethink the paradigm. It was never going to solve the crisis of neoliberal agriculture, but it did lay bare the crisis and pushed us to think differently of solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Navsharan. That is, really important to hear from the field, and that was really interesting. So thank you so much, and I'm going to introduce our fourth speaker. Professor Surinder S. Jodhka is Professor of Sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. His research, again, many of us have, read his work, and we are, well acquainted with it, focuses on caste relations, on agrarian change and contemporary rural India, and on community identities. His many and influential publications include Contested Hierarchies, Caste and Power in 21st Century India, A Handbook of Rural India, The Indian Middle Class with Asim Prakash, and Caste in Contemporary India. He's also editor of the Routledge India book series on religion and citizenship. Surinder, all yours.
Thank you so much, Smriti and Vamsi, for asking me to be part of this discussion. It's really a kind of matter of honor for me in company of very distinguished economists. I'm kind of going to make that point also in my presentation that I'm not an economist, as you introduced me. I'm a sociologist. And I would, in some sense, try to make my point slightly differently and in a sense extend some of the points that Navsharan has already made and others have also made. I'm not really in that sense in disagreement with anyone, but I think when we are talking about farmers or agriculture in the context of farmers movement, and I think that context also becomes very, very significant. And there is also in some sense beyond the frames of political economy kind of issue. And that is where I would like to kind of focus my discussion. Economic distress and agrarian crisis is a very well-known phenomenon, and all of us have been talking about it for the last many, many years, at least 3 or 4 decades. People have been talking about it. Distress has been growing. Suicides have been occurring. Farmers have been very unhappy. There have been other occasions where state has taken policy decisions which are very clearly agriculture. But if you look at the post-1980s, early 90s, farm politics had actually been consistently declining. And this was something which was happening across India. We saw its revival in the last 2, 3 years, 5 years, and that in some sense needs to be understood as a process by itself. Of course, there are economic processes which at some level underlay it or overlay it, or they are on the side. But I think one needs to also look at mobilizations in a kind of perspective which looks at those sociological or social and political processes along with kind of questions of what one would call as political economy, question of class, question of livelihoods, or question of agriculture as a state subject versus market and stuff like that, on which we have heard very knowledgeable kind of discussion. So I'm not in some sense trying to provide a counterpoint to those, but also kind of extending it into non-economic sphere, and that's what I would try to do. We all know, as Smriti right in the beginning said, that these were massive mobilizations. And these not only in post-liberalization India, but perhaps also largest mobilization, and perhaps in these kinds of agrarian mobilizations happening in the world, a movement lasting 1 full year, more than a year. And in some sense, it started in July last year, and movement is still continuing, and perhaps it will continue for several years. And there's a continuity. I mean, even though Punjab elections at some level have disrupted the movement, but I think the farmers' unions say that our movement is not really over. It was just a moment in that movement that they've come back from Delhi. So when you have such effective, and I would say at some level successful mobilization, one also needs to ask other questions which are obvious political and mobilizational questions. Who participated? Who led them? What was their ideology? The obvious kind of questions that social movements people ask, and they are relevant. I think they are relevant if we have to understand the dynamics of social movements themselves. They also reflect on questions of caste, question of class, question of gender, question of region, and many other questions which would also at some level shape our futures. And they are shaped by history, and they're shaped by our present, but they have in some sense great implications or big implications for the way we kind of look ahead in our political life in India. And that's why I think your title Modi becomes very critical, and all of us have been excited about this farmers movement because we connect with them, even though we have very little to do with agriculture directly. But there is a larger kind of threat to Indian democracy, which we all saw farmers movement in some sense trying to kind of come forward and in some sense providing a very effective resistance. And if we recognize that, then also we need to raise these broader sociological questions. And they are not very simple questions. They are not, the answers are also not very predictable, right? If one looks at say, for example, who participated, very clearly the movement was started by Punjabi farmers, and they were not just Punjabi farmers. There was also a question of caste and class embedded in it. More than class, it was question of caste. Almost everyone who mobilized themselves from Punjab, they were Jat Sikhs. They were Sikhs and they were Jats, and they were landed farmers in one way or the other. There were very few people who were landless and farmers and who were part of the movement. Same was the case with people who joined them in Haryana. Their younger brothers, as Punjabi farmers called them, they were also Jats. They were Jats, and as they are called, but they have at some level common kind of caste and kind of ethnic kinship background. In UP also, it was mostly the Western UP Jat farmers led by Takayat, who came and kind of provided at some level broader alliance to farm unions. And if you look at the leadership, and this is something that one of my students has been documenting, almost all the farm unions in Punjab, except perhaps one or two, are led by Jats, right? Jat Sikhs, and their identities are very visibly worn, and that's something which we need to kind of recognize. Ideology is a difficult question, and I'll come to this at the end of the discussion. And if you look at again, continuing with Navsharan, I would also focus on Punjab for various reasons. One, my work has been mostly on Punjab farmers, and it connects with my earlier work on Punjab. Two, that was also something that I was focusing on in my own field work and my own observations. So I will confine myself to Punjab largely. And they were also the ones who, at some level, leading the movement, and from where the movement started, and they would perhaps remain, even though Takayat's arrival was very, very significant politically, and participation of Haryana farmers was also very, very critical. Without that, farmers movement would not have lasted. But still, I think understanding Punjab in its own regional, local context becomes very significant, and it also becomes significant in context of the farmer side. And the point I want to make here is, beyond caste and class, there was also a very self-conscious mobilization of Sikhi, right? And I make a distinction between Sikhism and Sikhi. Sikhi is more of a kind of way of life of the Sikhs in Punjab, which includes institutions which go beyond Sikh religion, but its identification with Sikh religion is very central. And if you have been following even on YouTube or Facebook, the sites of farms protest, this was something which was very, very obvious and very visible. And almost everyone who came to these stages, as Navsharan was talking about, started with Sikh slogans. Wahguru Ji da Khalsa, Wahguru Ji di Fateh, Sarbat da Pala. These were words that many people who did not know got familiar with. And all the singers who were singing from these stages, they sang in Punjabi, they used Punjabi idiom, and very frequently used Sikh idioms. I think that's very, very critical, and that is significant to understand various other things. Both the major sites where Punjab farmers were present, Tikri and Singhu, prominently had gurudwaras. One of the first things they set up there were the Sikh gurudwaras, and these Sikh gurudwaras were very active sites of everyday life there. People who were living there, they would go to gurudwaras, will do prepare. And most importantly, I think what sustained the movement was the langars, where you could get free food. Now, langars were not only feeding the farmers who were working there, who were sitting there, they were also feeding the neighborhoods and the poor people in the neighborhood. And that was very, very significant, because they were feeding the neighborhoods. Lots of people, in some sense, did not have the courage to oppose them. And the moment they saw that there was so much of food being served, many of the local well-to-do people wanted to participate and begin to participate. There are many stories which one can kind of talk about here. And most importantly, the colors that Navsharan was talking about, yellow and green, but also kesari. And if you look at, in Punjab, you won't see so many turbans. But on these borders, you saw kesari turbans, the saffron color, the yellow turbans, which is color of the left-wing farm unions from Malwa, and the green color, which is the color of BKU and stuff like that. And this was, at some level, very interesting representation of Sikhi, because it was not only the pro-religion politics or unions, which were called as the Akali unions or Khalsa unions, who were also, some of them were also pro-Khalistan political activists who were participating, but even the leftists, somebody like Ugraham. So from comrades, as they were called, comrades to Akalis, comrades to Sikhs, comrades to Khalsas, everyone was supporting their turbans, and turbans were very, very prominent, and with kind of flowing beards and different colors, that at some level provided a kind of, identity and image, which at some level ended up mobilizing the Sikh community globally. Almost entire, one of the leaders told me that Sikh Bhaichara is completely mobilized and they are supporting us. And this was not simply a kind of emotional support, but it was also much more, right? In case of Punjab, I perhaps would not fully agree with Barbara. All the intermediate classes were also actively supporting. The traders were completely with farmers. If you go to Chandigarh and Matka Chowk, every single day there would be protests in favor of farmers. These were students, these were middle class people, these were people from all kinds of social backgrounds. The entire Punjab, even though at the center of it was the Jat Sikh, but at the same time, hardly anybody said anything against farmers' movement, and that's how they were able to carry this forward. So from rural to urban, from local to the regional, from Punjab to the diasporic Sikh, almost everyone in some level was involved and mobilized, and this is where we need to, in some sense, also begin to think about agriculture differently. Now, the question of caste, class, and diversities is very, very significant. As Barbara also pointed out, that there are different kinds of regional trajectories. Punjab's agriculture has its own trajectory. Compared to the national level, in some sense, holding size, Punjab is a much larger holding size. Punjabi farmers have much more stake in agriculture. But if you look at question of caste, Punjab also has a much greater, in some sense, contradiction of caste terms. I mean, Dalits in Punjab, who make for 32% of the total population, in rural areas, they make up to 40, 45, in some areas, even 50%, don't own any land. They're almost universally landless. So class and caste overlaps in Punjab in a very, very specific way. And that's why at some level, you don't have any Dalit leading any of the farmers' union, even though they might be technically by economists listed as agricultural laborers. They don't identify with agriculture in that sense. Some of them are mobilized by left-wing unions as farm laborers, but I think their identification is more with caste kind of politics, identity politics, rather than with class politics. This is also because their employment, their livelihood does not come from agriculture primarily. It does come from agriculture also, but it also primarily comes from, or dominantly comes from non-farm kind of, and these are changes that have happened over past many years. And we need to recognize these kinds of differences. And within these differences, how Punjabi farmers were able to, at some level, turn it into a kind of Punjabi identity issue. Now, let me come to the last point that we want to make a little more kind of in detail. I think, of course, there are questions of economic history, the question of agriculture and state policy, and question of city and the countryside, and the kind of biases that state policies have. But I think movements like this are also moments of churning. They are moments of churning at various levels. I mean, they're moments of churning for people who are participating in these moments, but they perhaps also should be seen as moments of churning for our own understanding intellectually. I myself kind of, felt very, very compelled to take many things seriously, which I never took earlier, right? For example, how do you mobilize your cultural resources in order to produce an effective social movement? And this is something that I think in the classical left politics has never been taken seriously. And I think how do we do this is something which needs a lot of work. In the classical agrarian studies language, one would perhaps think of these as a populist movement, because they were talking about farming, they were talking about agriculture in a very aggregate sense of the term, even though they were in some sense located in certain kind of castes and classes. They did not talk about those differences directly, openly. But was it a populist movement? Tentatively speaking, my answer would be no. It was something new. It was something else. It was also, in some sense, not a class movement, right? Was it a movement of the rich farmers? Certainly not. And that is where I think a question of reimagining economies and things like agriculture becomes so prominent. And one needs to, in some sense, look at movements as not simply moments of being. And that moment of being was people who are farmers from Punjab, who are Jat Sikhs, and they come to this movement for the first time historically. They begin to also see themselves in class terms, that we need to talk about Dalits, we need to talk about women, we need to talk about class. And they were talking about Dalit Bhaichara and Kisan Mazdoor Ekta, and the question of once in a week was given to women to manage. This is something that has not been perhaps done anywhere in the country. or perhaps in most degrading societies, and Punjab, which is kind of seen as the most patriarchal culture, which it is. But at the same time, this was a moment of not only being, but at some level also a moment of becoming, a point that I've been making in many of my papers on this. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. That was, again, I think, thinking about it as a moment of churning, that's exactly why we are having these discussions, and probably will for a long time as we try to understand what's unfolding. So I'm going to introduce our fifth speaker, Jayati Ghosh, taught economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi for almost 35 years before joining the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where she is now professor of economics. In addition to her academic work, which spans analyses of the gendered labor market, of fiscal policy, international trade, international finance, she is a member of several international commissions and writes regularly for popular media. So, Jayati.
Thank you so much, Smriti. And it's really a pleasure to follow on such excellent presentations, because it means my task is so much easier. I really have, basically footnotes to add to what has been said. But I want to actually make a slightly different point, which is that the farmers' protests that we saw in opposition to the farm laws have a prehistory. And I think it's important to know that prehistory, because it gives a sense of what exactly these demands are. I do believe that there's been a lot of misrepresentation even in the media about these farmers' demands, and they have been often stated rather simplistically. Yes, there was opposition to the 3 farm laws, but well before, and currently there is a demand for a higher MSP, which would cover the Swaminathan Commission recommendations of the C2 plus 50%. But there are many more demands, and these demands have been openly, explicitly expressed by the farmers' movement for at least 5 years now. I'm thinking back on 2017-18, when we saw the first significant rumblings of organized protest by farmers across the country. And it's, yes, they were certainly there in Punjab, but they were there in many other parts of the country, in Bengal, in Maharashtra, in Telangana, in Odisha, in Rajasthan, in Gujarat, in Karnataka. We saw farmers' movements. 2018 was, if you like, a really high point of these protests. There were major long marches in Maharashtra. I mean, public memory is short, but that was really a very big thing. There was a massive mobilization of farmers from all over the country for a long march to Parliament, which took over a month for farmers from different parts of the country, culminating in November 2018 in a very big mobilization of farmers in the city of Delhi. Of course, they were not allowed to get to Parliament. They were confined to the Ramlila Maidan. I remember seeing Navsharan on the outskirts of one of those protests way back in 2018. What were these protests about? And in a sense, you cannot understand the protests against the farm laws without recognizing that there were these prior mobilizations, which also involved the bringing together of many different kinds of farmers' organizations. For the first time, I would say, really since the 1970s. So, and early 1980s. So the point is that the Sanyukt Kisan Morcha, which was formed in 2020, which as a response, in a sense, to the farm laws, was the outcome of coming together of different farm organizations for these earlier prior protests, okay? And these protests did involve between 35 to 40 different farm organizations representing all kinds of farmers, representing rich farmers from Punjab and UP and Western UP and so on, certainly, but also tribal groups, women's groups, small farmers groups, different, the Kisan sabhas of the communist parties, all kinds of different groups were involved, representing many different socioeconomic strata. How is it that they could come together? And what was it that was driving this? Now, I think, the structural systemic problems of Indian agriculture have been highlighted so well by Barbara. I don't need to go into that. And I think Chandru has talked about this whole tension between, the intersectoral terms of trade, the prices of agriculture vis-a-vis what it gets in return. And I think these definitely played a very, very major role. But what's important to note is that the demands of these farmers were far more detailed and sophisticated. It's convenient to summarize them in terms of implement Swaminathan Commission. But let's face it, the Swaminathan Commission report was, excuse me, sorry, let me just try and turn this off. The Swaminathan Commission report is, more than 1,000 pages long. It contains several hundred recommendations. So what exactly was the focus? Here is the point, that it was not just about the issue of whether or not you will get predatory commercialization of agriculture through the farm laws, which, as has been shown, disproportionately favor corporates. It was really about making farming viable. And in that sense, these demands, one of these major demands of the month-long march to Parliament was to convene a special 10-day session of Parliament in which there would be 3 days devoted to different aspects of the farming. And they gave details, they gave an agenda. They identified the particular concerns they had. There was the whole issue of access to resources, land, water, bioresources, and how those were being dramatically altered. There was the issue of ecologically viable farming, which many farmers across the country face, that was raised specifically. There was the issue of how research and development in Indian agriculture, and then the extension services, which provide so-called knowledge, were heavily favored to chemical inputs and corporate interventions rather than sustainable small-scale farming, and that they were not being funded to enable any feasible shifts towards more ecologically viable farming. There was a demand for land rights for the so-called forest dwellers, people who have been farming there for generations but are identified as forest dwellers without proper land rights. There were the demands of women farmers that Navsharan has highlighted. There were the demands related to irrigation, the kinds of irrigation that have been put, the privatization of water that happens when you just allow groundwater irrigation to proliferate, the problems of inputs, and the fact that there was massive commercialization of the input process to the point where basically large corporations were entering and squeezing farmers and also providing the kind of credit that would enable them to use them, locking them into specific exploitative credit relations. There was the problem of other credit, the ways in which both credit markets and insurance markets are structured, which would be impossible for any large corporate in India to function under. Those laws are absolutely crazy. The regulations under which credit and insurance markets function for Indian agriculture would not be possible in any other economic activity in India or anywhere else in the world. The issue of the crop prices themselves, which has now been elevated to be the top issue, but in a sense, it's a kind of shorthand for all of these other issues. The demand for remunerative crop prices is also effectively a demand for making sure agriculture is viable, and it requires all of these things to be viable. The issue of post-harvest technology processing, what do you do? How do you enable farmers to get some value added? The non-farm other activities, livestock, and so on. So in other words, these are really smart and detailed demands. And these were demands made by farmers, not by economists, not by the business journalists who were writing often very uneducatedly about these matters. So I think we have to recognize this is really a very sophisticated movement. It has brought together people from very different types of agriculture, different classes, as Surinder was mentioning. Well, maybe in Punjab it's dominantly Jat, but it is really the diversity of people and farmers and those engaged in farming, including farm workers, that was involved in this movement from 2018 onwards is remarkable. And it shows that you can get unity along these things, even when us commentators from the sidelines would not expect it. And I think these are critical in understanding the continued resilience and strength of the farmers. As has been pointed out, Surinder mentioned it, Navsharan mentioned it, this is not a movement that's over. The so-called success, the farmers themselves don't see it as a success. And of course they claim, January 31st, just a month or two, less than 2 months ago, was observed as a day of betrayal by the farmers, with demonstrations across India, because of the fact that many of their demands, which the government had explicitly acceded to, have not been met, including withdrawing the cases against many farmers, instituting cases against those leaders of the ruling party who had committed violence, rammed into peaceful protesters and so on, and that some of their central demands. And putting MSP as one central demand is, as I said, it's a shorthand. It is not necessarily that they say, do this in a very simplistic way. They're pointing out that our costs are too high, so do something about those costs. Our productivity is falling, our soil productivity is falling, do something about that. That requires public investment, that requires different kinds of regulation, that requires different kinds of public intervention. And they're very sophisticated demands. They are not simplistic demands. I really just want to highlight that. So yeah, this essentially is all I wanted to say. I wanted to say that this is a movement with a longer recent prehistory. And for that very reason, it is going to have a longer future as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jayati. I am sure that people have questions and comments, and so I want to encourage everybody to put them into the link that's in the chat right now. Please send us your questions, and hopefully we'll have time to get to some of them in the question and answer portion. We do have today two excellent discussants, and so they're going to just give us a brief response to these very wide-ranging comments. So I do not envy them in their task. But first I want to introduce Sirisha Naidu. Sirisha is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Her research interests focus on feminist political economy analyses of agrarian change, of ecological change, and the interweaving of production and reproduction in the economies of the global South. So Sirisha.
Thank you, Smriti, and I'm going to hope that the comments that the speakers have offered us and the talking points or the thinking points that they have offered us and that they've been writing about have been so significant. So I hope I can do justice to all of that, all of what has been said today, and all of what has been written so far by our current speakers and others. So first, I want to thank all the speakers. I want to start with what Jayati mentioned, which is the prehistory of farm laws and hence, the continuance, because really, the topic, of course, is like, what is this moment that we see with the farmers' protests and the farmers' movement with respect to Modi's India. So in continuing with Jayati's point that there is a prehistory of protests and mobilization, I want to kind of extend that, right? Because these mobilizations on agrarian issues, and by talking about agrarian issues, I also want to talk about forest issues, are not even limited to the last 5 years, right? The land issues are not just last 5 or 10 years, or even since the agrarian crisis, right? So in Punjab, we know that there were demands for land made by the Zamin Prapti Sangharsh Committee. We know that there were demands made by Dalits during the Azadi Cooch in Gujarat in 2017, and they very specifically demanded land reform. We know that there was this tremendous effort that went into passing the Forest Rights Act in 2007, where both Adivasi and non-Adivasi and forest dwellers are able to claim individual as well as, more significantly, community land rights. We know it's evident in the ways in which tribal and Adivasis in central India, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa have, really put their bodies on the line against land dispossession, just so common among, when you're, part of a marginalized community and live on and claim mineral-rich land as your heritage. It's also evident the way that farmers have discussed their opposition, not only against farm laws, as Jayati and others mentioned, but also, and Surinder has written about this, against the corporate invasion of the agrarian sector and the potential loss of land as a result, right? So as much as we hear all these issues of agrarian issues, we also hear this issue of this fear of becoming landless, of losing land, of losing livelihoods, right? And again, Surinder, Navsharan, Jayati, and others have written and talked about this. So these struggles are not just framed by those resisting struggles for land, but they are also struggles for identity and dignity. And Surinder talked about this, right? And the farmers' protests can be viewed not just against farm laws, not just against electricity prices, but against sort of what they are facing and what they have seen in the rest of the country, which is pauperization and the erosion of dignity. And many have written that the farmers' protests are not new, but what I want to add and kind of summarize from what has been said today is that what is also not new is the struggle for land, livelihoods, and dignity against pauperization and dispossession. What I think is new for this moment is that these two sets of demands have collided to form a new, sharper, more well-resourced and more sophisticated analysis and mobilization. So the farmers' protests have very squarely centered life and resistance in the center of discussions. They've framed capitalism and the processes of neoliberalism in that context. So in the question that I want us to think about in this context of sustaining life, what role does land play, right? It's clear that, and others have talked about it today, that agrarian livelihoods have been severely eroded, but it's also true that the non-agrarian sector has been unable to offer stable livelihoods either. So in 2016, Lynn Osome and I published a piece in Agrarian South where we argue that this livelihood diversification, which is a really euphemistic term, is indicative of the immiseration that rural India is experiencing. And in that context, land, whether it's private or common lands, continue to hold tremendous significance because it's the last bastion of this ability to survive, this ability to reproduce yourself, right? And in our work, we've also found similar yet differing processes afoot in Southern Africa as well. So this continued significance of the protest, of course, as again others have pointed out, depend on a multitude of factors. Surinder has talked about the Kisan Mazdoor Ekta. The question is whether that will hold, whether that will transcend the protest sites, whether they can resolve the contradictions of gender. And we know that the repeal of neoliberalism doesn't necessarily solve the problems of neoliberal crisis, like C.P. Chandrasekhar talked about. But we do know, and Surinder, thank you for these gems, right? Like movements like this are moments of churning for society and our own understanding. And here is how I see like my understanding being challenged, right? And I imagine others as well, right? Is these old class categories, the understanding of class interests, right? I mean, that has changed. And we know, of course, people like Bernstein, Sam Moyo and Paris Heroes have talked about it in various contexts. But really, what is, as Navsharan pointed out, like what are the different agrarian questions that are specific to specific regions, that are specific to specific moments, even in contemporary times? We know that what has been laid bare is the contradictions that have deepened in the last decade and have made lives and livelihoods more precarious. And what we can see is that, at least in this moment, that these precarious or this precarity of life and livelihoods cannot be indefinitely papered over by the Hindutva identity. And we see a challenge to this, right? So when Surinder said that, looking at the farmers out in protesting, like there was this sense of hope, in terms of mobilization, in terms of, the cultural forms which have taken on significance. And I'm running out of time and I don't want to take too much time. So the other thing I also want to emphasize is what Navsharan has talked about today, but in her own writings about these cultural forms, right? And the question that Surinder posed about how do you mobilize these cultural resources, right? These identities, right? Which are very, very different from how we in the left think about mobilization and identity, which is purely or sometimes purely in class terms. So I just want to leave everyone with this one thought, that the success of the farmers' protests sort of doesn't just lie in repealing the farm laws or even the demands that they have placed, which have been much more extensive, the cross-cultural, cross-caste, but also cross-region, right? Like so many different parts of India came out either in physical support or from afar. But I think that the success lies in expanding our imagination of resistance, and by providing inspiration and stories that future collective resistances can draw from. And also imagining what does building a potential future hold, right? And just for us to begin to hope again. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Sirisha. I am going to introduce our second discussant, after which, we'll give the speakers a chance to respond and then turn to the Q&A. So I can see some questions coming in, but please feel free to put your questions in the form link in the chat. So our second discussant is Vamsi. Vamsi Vakulabharanam is the co-director of the Asian Political Economy Program at PERI. And he's associate professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His current research projects include economic inequalities and spatial segregation in Indian cities, class and economic inequality in India and China, and developing a class-caste composite framework. Vamsi.
Thank you, Smriti. I will take 3-4 minutes just to raise a couple of questions. And what I'll do is, the speakers, all 5, talks were outstanding. So I'm just going to ask questions about what is the way forward, right? So I think that is the thing that I'll highlight. So if the first question is about the long-term political economy in India, so if you go back to the 80s, between 40s and 80s, there were 3 dominant classes, the urban capitalists, urban professionals, and the rural elites. And after 1980s, you see the rural elites significantly urbanizing themselves, especially the richer farmer groups, in multiple regions of India. And this has also begun to, at that time, reduce the bargaining power of the agrarian interests as a whole, even though market intermediaries are still there, in rural areas, and they still play a key role in both providing capital and also extracting surplus, which also impoverishes the larger agrarian population, different farming groups and agricultural workers. But this, element of the rural elite is now facing very high competition from the corporate capital, which seems to have the highest priority in Modi's political economy, in the political economy of Modi's India. So, but at the same time, what you also see is, the urban rapid growth that, India has witnessed after reforms has been largely jobless, or, it has not created, good jobs, for a vast majority of Indians. So it has created all these, migrants, who stay for some time in urban spaces, sometime in rural spaces, or these categories of farmer workers, which we'll have to contend with. I think a significant part of the protest was also, this farmer worker category. So this then leaves the various agrarian groups somewhat abandoned by the government. This includes farmers of different classes and castes, and also agricultural workers, women, vulnerable women, especially related to all these migrant workers. And the government is not really pitching for this particular constituency. So what's the way forward? How do these vulnerable agricultural groups, which do not have sufficient representational power now, or sufficient bargaining power, create sturdy institutions that can safeguard the their current interests, and provide remunerative livelihoods? That is one point, one question. The second question is, we all know that, and this has also come up in Barbara's presentation, Green Revolution-induced agricultural model has run into 2 kinds of crises. One is, post-liberalization. There's a double squeeze of farmers. Input prices have risen. Credit has become more costly. At the same time, output prices are not stable. On the other hand, there's also a long-term ecological degradation, right? Whether it is soil depletion or, exploitation of groundwater resources, a bunch of things that come from the monocropping that, this model promoted. So using this moment of protests, and the fact that, we all agree the proposed loss was not the right direction to take, but, can we comment a little bit on what is the direction to take, right? Using the protests as a point of departure, can we do a big rethink, and how do we move forward from this, the crisis of the Green Revolution-induced agriculture in pushing towards remunerative livelihoods and ecologically sustainable agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vamsi. And actually, I'm going to tack on an audience question to one of Vamsi's points. And the audience question, I'm going to summarize was, while we protested this particular set of reforms, and, we might agree that those were not appropriate, what reforms do we think might be, important for Indian agriculture moving forward? What kinds of changes or restructuring or reforms? So that was one of the questions, and I'm going to add that to sort of Vamsi's general point about thinking about the way forward. So we'll turn it over to the 5 speakers. Maybe we'll just go in order of presentation. So Barbara can begin, and we can follow, and I guess you can pick what you wish to respond to and take a few minutes to do so.
Thank you, Smriti. Can you hear me? Yes. Very interesting discussion after an extremely interesting panel. Thank you all very much. I want to answer one question from Sirisha and one, perhaps 2 from Vamsi, if that's all right. Sirisha made the point that the agrarian question takes different forms in different regions, and I agree with that. And I think that we as scholars and involved and engaged scholars need to be sure that we have a better analysis than at present of labour struggles, classes of labour in agrarian regions of India. I really think there isn't a lot of literature that specifically does this. And addresses the issue of self-employment or petty commodity production, where the exploitation isn't through labour markets, but other markets, product markets, money markets, rent, etc., etc. That we should be more rigorous than we have been about struggles over the shares of surplus. I mean, calling them all value chains and supply chains is, I think, a cop-out. We need to know more about the post-harvest system and the way in which the shares are divvied up and struggled over. It's not just that big retail is rolling over everything else. So there is a lot of tension in the post-harvest system. And in the same way, we talk about capitalism and capital, but it's very clear that in the agrarian system, there are fractions of capital. There are regional fractions, but there are also size fractions. And these fractions are struggling the intermediate classes against the corporate sector. We know very little about these struggles. I've looked and looked on the internet, and I don't find the business associations coming out with statements about where they stand on the farm laws, for instance. And lastly, there's a massive informal economy. And of course, that affects what we know and how we know it. I could come back to that later. Vamsi, very good questions about how the protest is to be strengthened. And I was hugely impressed with a talk recently by Prakash Karat, who listed out, I think it was the Foundation for Agrarian Studies that put this talk on, very interesting talk, where he went through the things that he thinks are quite unique about this protest. Well, there's not time to list them now, but they're all in his talk and it's all on the web. And those ideas deserve analysis as well as, scaling up. And you made a very powerful point about ecology that we all have neglected. And I think it's not just a matter of neglect, actually. I think that there are forces in India who are positively hostile to it, including the forces that think the solution is zero budget natural farming, about which there is very little evidence for its practical feasibility. So we have a Tower of Babel, we have dozens and dozens of different names for practices. We have a particular way of conducting science, which is different from the CGIAR. And we face the agroecological movement as a whole faces active marginalization, expulsion. and needs to be analysed in those terms. Anyway, thank you very much for lots and lots of very fascinating questions.
Thank you, Barbara. Did you, I think Professor Chandrasekhar, Chandru? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think much has been said. I agree with all of it. And I just want to respond to briefly to the fundamental question which Vamsi posed, and where do we take it from here, as it were. I'm not sure this can be answered, without actually taking into consideration the fact that the agency which can actually make a difference, if there is a difference going to be made, has to be the state. You cannot have, atomistic, dispersed farmers, in some sense, coming together to generate a movement which will transform agriculture in an ecologically positive and productivity enhancing direction. In this, it's interesting that first, what is the current situation? Part of the reason why these farm laws are there is that the government is in some sense saying that we are giving up our responsibility to try and transform agriculture. Let these corporates come and enter into these agreements with farmers, and they are going to improve productivity and they're going to make a difference. So obviously that's sort of abdicating the responsibility of the state. The second is, if you look at the arguments about people who are responding to the farmers' demands, they, for example, would say that, listen, take, for example, the demand that there should be a legally guaranteed minimum support price with the Swaminathan formula. And the two arguments for that, against that, which, among many, is one is, of course, that this would actually result in a fiscal crisis, because the government will have to outlay so much money that you're not going to be able to manage the fisc, which is already under strain. And the second is that this is going to continue this process of, biasing production in favor of certain crops, which are water intensive, etc., and therefore ecologically devastating. Now, an argument of that kind doesn't take into consideration the fact that, first of all, when you guarantee a minimum support price, all you're doing is offering a floor. You're not saying that the government is going to procure all of that. That determines a floor, and then the market will actually offer prices which, hopefully, if the procurement system and the distribution system works, would offer prices which are slightly higher than that. So it's not going to be all from the government's fisc that you're going to do it. And two, you don't have, you can change the structure of support which are provided. So change the structure of MSPs. Try and move people into crops which won't be so damaging in particular regions by offering better prices for those crops. Whereas now you've been focused more on wheat and rice and, to a certain extent, cotton, etc. So, even the way in which those who are responsible for shaping or influencing government policy speak is one which is trying to say that the government cannot do anything about it. So I do think that unless we can do something about that, resolving this agricultural crisis or moving towards resolving it is going to be difficult. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Would Navsharan like to?
Smriti, we really can't hear you at all.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Navsharan. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for all the presentations and excellent questions which the two discussants posed. I think I'm going to respond to the question of what next, and where do we go from here. And I think I'm a student of movements, and so I think while this movement was there, and as Jayati rightly said, it built on the previous movements and previous mobilizations, but there was a realization that in the last few years, India's right-wing regime has disenfranchised poor. And they've done it section by section, community by community, forcing them to fight their own battles. And on the farmers' platform, there was a growing realization that only effective resistance is through building solidarity and exerting moral pressure. And I think this was a lesson which was very evident. So farmers did actually provide the platform for various sections to come. So right from different kinds of from Himachal's apple growers to people from Western UP whose standing crops are ruined by cattle which are let loose on them by policy, by cow policy. So, and there were pastoral communities, there were Adivasi, there were people who came from Assam. So there was this really a realization that there's something which needs to be done, and which is building alliances and building larger movements by putting moral pressure, exerting moral pressure to make the state accountable. So what Chandru is saying about, it's the role of the state, and movements cannot build an alternative, but movements and only movements can push the state to be more accountable and looking at the options with people in mind, not some ideas which come from wherever. The second thing I just want to mention is that there was a lot of discussion that in the movement, although Mazdoor Kisan or laborers and farmers unity was spoken about, but actually laborers were not there, which is kind of both true and false, because labor, unlike farming communities, they do not have the luxury of not working on daily wage and be sitting here. So they were, while they were not big, there was not a big presence of Mazdoors or laborers, there were leaders of Mazdoor movements who were very much part of the protest. And one of the things which is probably not known very much is that, inspired by some Yukt Kisan Morcha or farm unions coming together in Punjab, 8 labor unions, farm labor unions, agriculture labor, Dalit unions came together to form a single morcha, and it's called United Labor Front. And they put a demand charter which included right to land, right to Shamlat land, right to commons, right to land to build homes, because a lot of the people, as was said, in fact, Surinder mentioned this, that they are no longer dependent on are not landless, are not dependent on agriculture because they find employment elsewhere, but they do need to come back to their villages. Cities are not holding them, so they need land to build homesteads, and this is the largest demand they put together. And on building alliance, they the demand charter of this United Labor Front includes a demand that those farmers, marginal farmers who have become landless because of the indebtedness and whose lands have been confiscated, should also be given land, 2.5 acres of land from the total pool of land which is available of both which is above the land ceiling limit of 20 acres, and also the common, the Shamlat land, which runs into several lakhs. I don't have the figures at the moment, but there are figures which are available, that this much land is available. And this labor, United Labor Front actually raised the demand, which is was a wonderful example of building alliance and doing something about the primary, the contradiction between labor and the landed community. So I'll end at that. Thanks.
Thank you. Surinder?
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, extending some of the points that Navsharan has made, I don't disagree with her, except that we do need to, when we are talking about Punjab and agriculture, we do need to keep talking about caste as well. Caste doesn't go away simply because, you know, there are political mobilizations. I mean, there are ground realities. So we do need to engage with caste. I'm not questioning the point that you're making, and this is not something. Yeah. So the main point, I think the word that Jayati used was sophisticated, and I think we need to have that kind of sophisticated way of, or sophisticated route of engaging with the present context. Yes, there is prehistory, no doubt about it, in Punjab, in agriculture, at the national level, globally. Obviously, there is a lot of prehistory, but there was something new about it. And that is, we need to ask this question: when and how agriculture gets mobilized as a cultural question of dignity and identity. And I think that is something which was, in some sense, I'm not, Pagadi Sambhal Jatta is not something which is completely new, but in this movement, and that's where we need to also focus, not that other things are not to be identified. When and how agriculture gets mobilized as a cultural question of dignity and identity. And I think that's where the point that Sirisha made, that in last 30 years, there has been massive decline of agriculture. There is massive out-migration from rural to urban. Even if it doesn't show in numbers, everyone is mobile. People are looking for alternatives. I was doing empirical work in Haryana and Punjab, and young people did not want to identify with agriculture. They want some employment outside, and they go outside and they are not able to find any space for themselves. Even when they get jobs which are very undignified jobs, and they have to compete with young kids growing up in urban areas, learning English in a very different way when they have to enter corporate capital. So one needs to understand the larger context in which neoliberal capitalism has evolved in India, and where people then come back to their village and they see this as their viable, not exactly an alternative, but not something that they want to lose. And that's how, the young people began to identify with agriculture during this process. They were not earlier identified with agriculture. And you can see these, things, young people coming in. When they started from Punjab, they did not realize that they had so much energy. All these young people thought that this was something that we don't want to lose, even after having lost so much. And I think this question of the way alternative economies are not really viable, and that is what we need to kind of also recognize. And that's when, if we have to kind of make sense of this current moment. And this is where I think the larger political question becomes very significant. The point that I was making about Sikhi vis-a-vis Hindutva, it was not simply a question of mobilizing Sikh symbols. It was also demonstrating that how a regional culture can be much more inclusive. It can also be positive. It can invite others and they can join. And we are fighting also simultaneously against the exclusionary culture of Hindutva, which also was neoliberal capital. The way they were able to, in a very sophisticated way, combine this Hindutva push along with neoliberal policies. And they did not see them as economists and sociologists. They saw it as coming together in one form. Finally, just a minor point, not a minor point, a very major point, and on which others have also commented, Vamsi's point: where does the future lie? How do we go? And I think that's where I completely agree with Navsharan. Even though state has to be the central agency, and that's what farmers were demanding, that state needs to guarantee us some kind of secure price. They're not asking for state procurement. They were just asking for minimum support price at which market should buy our products. And if they don't buy, then the state should compensate for us. So they just want some kind of price guarantee, like you have right-based approach in other kinds of spheres. That's what they were arguing for. But I think the future lies in these realignments of political processes. That's where social movements become the only alternative possible. It would not happen within the state simply because technically one argument is better than the other argument, and policy-wise, it would not happen across policymakers debating about it, what is good and what is bad. So I think farmers recognize this, that this was not simply a question of agriculture. This was not simply a question of farm laws. This was not simply a question of economic policy. This is a systemic political question, and it is in the political process that the answers lie. And obviously, it has to be mediated through state, as Chandru very rightly pointed out. And I think finally, we also need to, at some level, reimagine for our own purpose in academic platforms, reimagine rural futures. We need to reimagine agrarian futures. We have a very limited view of agrarian futures and rural futures, where their end is taken for granted. And it needs to be conceptually thought about very differently. And that thinking, which starts with enlightenment, is so much kind of burdening policymakers also, even if they don't intend to. They think that this can't be, agriculture can't go on like this. It can perhaps go in like this if you bring in farmers also. That's what they were demanding. Fasal the Faisla Kisan Karega, Kamar Grewal singing, and that becomes the kind of title song for the movement. That is the farmers who ought to decide what should happen to agriculture. And that's where what Vamsi was talking about. We need to think about agriculture from down up. Green Revolution till now, it's the corporate capital, it's the global capital that has been deciding what agriculture should do. But I think that's where solution lies, and that has to be a political solution. And we need to think of agriculture more than an economy, more than a source of livelihood, also a much larger kind of life experience, which extends what Navsharan was saying, that person who goes to the city landless wants to come back in the village because there is homestead and you can live a dignified life with a kind of open space, with some kind of comfort, with some kind of friendships, with some kind of solidarities and a notion of your own culture.
Thank you. Jayati, would you like to?
Thank you. And once again, basically, I really just have a couple of footnotes or maybe underlining some points that were already made. I think it's absolutely true. It is the state that has to respond, but let's face it, the state has not been doing it. And it's certainly the Modi regime, but even before that, the state has not done what it could have done. And it's not because they didn't know what to do. It's not that nobody has an idea how to solve the problems of agriculture. There have been enough representations, government commissions, analyses, etc., of all of this to know very specifically it's a holistic problem, systemic problem in agriculture. You have to have systemic approaches to it. These have not been done. So yes, it can only happen through downward pressure. But here I want to just, in a sense, reiterate some points that were made earlier by Surinder, Navsharan, Barbara, and by Chandru, everybody, Barbara, that, this is one of those situations where, let's face it, we economists and we social scientists have learned more from the movement than we have contributed. They have actually been, and I repeat this point, it's a very sophisticated movement with very sophisticated demands. If only we would take the time and energy to read those demands carefully rather than the newspaper reports, which are extremely simplistic. And here I want to put in a plug for the Kisan Sabha. I think the Kisan Sabha documents on this, and by the way, the Kisan Sabha, the peasant wing of the Communist Party, both the CPIM and the CPI, have been among the leaders of this movement of bringing together the different farmers groups across the country, which is a heroic endeavor of getting agricultural labor involved, as Navsharan mentioned. But their documents are really excellent, and they have this holistic approach. You look at that set of demands, you know exactly how to do this. In ecological concerns are considered, issues of irrigation, issues of control over land, issues of access to inputs, resources, all of these are considered very deeply and with regional specificities. So they know what to do. They have been demanding that you do these things. The political will to do these things is not there. And that really means you have to have pressure. And for that, you need the coalitions that Navsharan was talking about. You need more and more people, workers and urban area and everywhere else to be part of these demands. I think, therefore, yeah, Barbara, you're right that there's, we need better analysis of labor struggles and so on. But here is where I think these social movements are a bit ahead of us in our analysis. And certainly, I think the way forward is one where the positive directions are known. The politics of India has been very depressing over the last decade or more, yes, but the way forward and the fact that there are these movements arising from the ground in different forms, whether it is the CAA protests, which again, I repeat, were extremely sophisticated. Every protest I attended had extremely sophisticated demands. They were not simplistic, just repeal the law. That was, if you like, a kind of shorthand for much wider demands for democracy and representation and accountability. Similarly, I think, the demand for MSP, it's a shorthand for a much wider, more complex system of demands. I think it's up to us to actually understand those demands. We shouldn't be telling farmer movement what to do when saying this is the blueprint for the future. They know much better than we do. And they have put it out there, I think, in very, very clear, nuanced, but nonetheless sophisticated terms about what needs to be done in policy terms. I think what's required really is for those of us who sympathize, understand, appreciate those demands to provide the kind of research that would feed in and provide better context and better sort of buttressing of those demands.
Thank you so much. If we have a little time, there are some questions from the audience, and so I would like to kind of maybe combine a couple. Two of the questions refer, and I'm going to combine them, to sort of the regional aspects that several of you have brought up. And both of them, though, I think one question is sort of what has been the participation of farmers and others outside of, Punjab, Haryana, Western UP. So what has been the extent of that participation? And the second question frames it as sort of a negative. It frames it as there has not been much participation from these other regions. Why do you think there hasn't? So I wonder if maybe some of you want to respond to that question and how you react. I see Jayati is go for it.
Yes, sorry, I get very upset about this one because it's completely false. Because the fact that media does not report the huge number of protests in solidarity with the things that were occurring on the outskirts of Delhi and in the Delhi borders and in Punjab and Haryana generally, the media doesn't report it, doesn't mean that they haven't been happening. There have been huge numbers of protests across the country. There have been expressions of support and solidarity. There have been marches. There have been all kinds of things going on over this period. And it's absolutely wrong to say that it was confined to us. I mean, yes, the protests in those borders, for obvious reasons, was confined to a relatively regionally concentrated group of farmers. But even then you had groups coming in from different, I mean, Navsharan can tell you, you constantly had groups coming in from different parts of the country. And as I said, the big protests of 2018, 2019, the long march to parliament, the massive protests in Maharashtra, in West Bengal, in Karnataka, in Gujarat, in Rajasthan, and others that, I mean, very many that I have not even mentioned and are not mentioned very much in the national media. This was not just a North Indian cowbelt protest at all.
Please, Surinder. Yeah.
Just to kind of add to the point that has already been made, I think the farmers over the period of 1 year, many people were saying that how will they last for so long? They not only lasted, they accumulated what one would call as moral capital, right? When they went to West Bengal, they may not have been very strong farmers' mobilization, but BJP lost and their vote share came down. And many people from Bengal told us, and farmers themselves said, that initially when they went there, they walked in streets of Calcutta just along with some local Sikhs, and suddenly they realized people were shutting their shops and joining them. And all those leftists who were planning to vote for Left Front, they decided that we will make sure that BJP is defeated, because that's what farmers were telling them. And that kind of solidarity across kind of it, not only farmers, but I think across sections of Indian society, and that's what made Indian government to kind of withdraw these laws. It was not something very easy to do. I mean, we had not expected, none of them us expected that it would happen like this. But they actually, in some sense, it was a very, very important moment in larger democratic struggle of politics, and there was large amount of support that farmers were getting, not only from protests in other parts of the country, but also from non-agrarian sections.
Okay, maybe I can ask a different question, which is, it is about Punjab, but I think
You have to speak louder. Sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, so it's specifically directed to Punjab, but I think we can kind of ask the question for the country as a whole. And the question is, in this moment of churning, as Surinder put it, what possible ways do you see this movement redefining caste, class, and gender relations in the rural agrarian structure? And do you see the possibility of the current agricultural paradigm, which is focused very much on paddy wheat production, extractive use of water, etc., being reformulated or overhauled? I don't know if anybody wants to.
Navsharan can go and I can come with.
Okay, I can start. On the question of gender and caste, I think it's very fair to say that very difficult questions were raised at the union platforms. I wouldn't say that any of the questions were resolved, but they were raised. They were Dalits who came and they said how they are discriminated. They were open discussion in many platforms on caste discrimination, and how this has become a way of life. So, I mean, there was something in the movement where a space was made for different viewpoints to come up. So nobody dragged a Dalit laborer down when the person is talking about how people are discriminated. How there's a beautiful play in Punjabi about a Dalit laborer, about all Dalit people are, when they work in the fields of landlords, they have to take their own tumbler to get tea and also dal and whatever food is given. And this play talked about when a Jat, a marginal peasant, loses his land and is now going to go and work in landlord's fields. He asks his wife, do I have to carry my tumbler? And so this was a powerful play which was staged at the, and then he says to the landless, the Dalit person, that you and I actually have everything in common, and this is the tumbler, which is a separate tumbler, which becomes a thing which divides us. So what divides us was very clear. What unites opened up. Similarly, on women question, I think on 8th March last year, it was the largest gathering of women on probably planet Earth, because I searched on internet. There were over 1 lakh women celebrating, marking International Women's Day, and they were at that platform. Many speakers said that they've been part of the movements. They've been part of earlier movements also. They talked about Tebaga. They talked about Telangana. They talked about Pepsu movement, where women fought with farmers shoulder to shoulder, but once the movement was over, they were sent back to cook chapatis at home. And even their people who they fought with as comrades did not hesitate to beat them when they became spouses. So, and they said that now you are on our watch. We will not let it happen. There was applause from the audience. And I think these were important conversations that happened. Nothing is resolved and nothing will get resolved. I mean, these are such fault lines, but a beginning was made. At least the questions were opened up. That's how I will say this.
I think somebody had mentioned this word hope. And I think that kind of summarizes everything. And I think it has opened up these questions of caste and gender in state like Punjab are being raised. I mean, nobody talked about gender question. If you look at the narratives of 1980s farmers movement, it was only the farmer. I mean, nobody talked about Kisan Mazdoor Ekta, and there was kind of demonization of Dalits actually. And that's why they brought migrant labor from outside. And this is something which kind of was also happening at structural level. Some of it, I think Navsharan already pointed out. But at another level, caste question in Punjab has also increasingly become an identity question structurally, because the kind of dependence that Dalits had on landed, one, big landlords are not there any longer because holdings have become smaller. There's a very small section of big landowners, but they're very, very small. So they are also become more similar. They're more like each other, but they're still divided on caste lines in the sense that Dalit localities will be away and there is a caste prejudice, or many of us have studied caste prejudice still exists and those boundaries are not really going to go away. But we saw for the first time in Punjab history, a Dalit chief minister was not only made by Congress party, but he was also very widely accepted. He was quite popular. We don't know what would happen in elections, but the fact that these became central to Punjab politics, and this is how I think these things take a very, very long time. But these are points of discussion now. You can't ignore them. Obviously, Punjab has not become caste-less or caste-free or patriarchy-less or patriarchy-free. All that is structurally very much there. But these have become points of discussion. And for the first time, after a long time, serious discussions are happening in rural Punjab around various platforms online as well as internally through various kinds of culture, which was already there earlier also there. But in last 20 years, we had seen a different kind of what one would call as cultural degeneration. The popular Punjabi songs would all be about daru and kudiyan, so liquor and women. So that is kind of being questioned publicly, that we need to have different kind of music, we need to have different kind of public culture, popular culture. And I think that is a remarkable, in some sense, progress. But again, how far will it go? We don't really know.
Would anyone else like to comment? Or okay, so I don't I think I want to just, maybe there's one last question that I can ask, just to make sure that the questioners the question is put to all of you, which is about the role of cooperatives. And again, this may relate also to the question of what might be future reforms we're interested in seeing. But does anybody want to comment on the possible role of cooperatives? Jayati?
Okay, if there are no takers, I'll go. But I know that I know Barbara and Chandru will definitely have a lot to say about this. Yeah, so the difficulty, I remember always advocating for cooperatives with policymakers, and you could just see their eyes glaze over. Literally, they would say, oh, been there, done that, it doesn't work, they get politicized, a few big bosses control it, etc. In other words, unfortunately, I personally still continue to believe that there is huge potential for cooperatives as a separate mode of dealing with many of these issues of economies of scale and access to markets and so on that otherwise plague smaller farmers vis-a-vis larger ones. It is true that the history of cooperatives in many of the states has not been that successful because of the facts of political takeover by local large landlords, etc., etc. Having said that, there are, I think, some very successful ones. The Kutumbashri cooperative of women in Kerala, I think, has a lot of potential as an indicator of the way forward. A number of the other cooperatives, smaller farmers cooperatives that are now cropping up in different parts of the country also. The laws currently actually inhibit the better functioning of cooperatives. And I think that also needs to be taken into account in terms of, by the way, again, to go back to this is something Kisan Sabha has got detailed and excellent documentation on. So really, I do want to highlight the fact that activists and unions in the farmers movement have been way ahead of us in the game. And they are really talking about specific changes that need to be made in laws and specific ways in which to take agriculture in India forward. Thanks.
Would Chandru or Barbara like to say anything?
Yeah, I just want to, it's a small footnote to that. I do think, for example, if you take credit cooperatives, the state in which credit cooperatives have played a very major role, are very active, is Kerala. And in fact, if you look at it in terms of the number of functioning credit cooperatives and the total population of credit cooperatives in India, it's completely dominated by Kerala. But we have an issue with regard to the central government and the Reserve Bank of India wanting to undermine the position of the states, using the example of some areas in which cooperatives have not been functioning, to bring the cooperatives under now outside of the regulation by the state government and bring it under the Reserve Bank and the central government, so, or the NABARD. So at the time of the demonetization, they actually didn't let primary credit cooperative societies do the job that they could have done at that point of time, in terms of conversion of the old notes into new notes, if those new notes are available. So I do think that, there are a lot of problems with cooperatives, but there are many success cases and success stories. So we should perhaps look at the success stories and see what else needs to be done to revive them.
Thank you so much. I think, this has been a really excellent discussion. I want to thank all of you for participating. And I want to thank, those who, put in questions, for your excellent questions. And I really want to, thank Arpita Bishwas, Kishore Kumar Surya Prakash, and Pedro de Almeida for all their technical and background support. Very much appreciated. So thank you all for joining, and we will make sure that the recording is made available. We'll email it to all the registrants so you'll all have copies of it. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you, Smriti, for chairing the session.
Sure. of
Yes,
course.
thanks,
My
Smriti.
pleasure.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, all the speakers.
Bye then.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.